So I had the chance to be able to go to the Holy Land in January 2019 as part of my seminary education. And one of the biggest just blessings about that, to be able to go there with my classmates, was to be able to go to the very places where Jesus walked and talked. So now whenever I read a Bible passage, it can really come alive for me in a very different way, because I can very vividly just remember what those places were like where these very gospel stories took place. And one of the more memorable ones was where today's gospel passage took place, Caesarea Philippi. It's an over 100-foot tall sheer rock cliff with a large cave opening, and in that opening is a deep spring. And built into that cliff and surrounding this cave grotto during Jesus' time was a massive temple to the pagan Greek god Pan, of which some archaeological remnants are still there at the site today. But what's most significant about this site, and what really ties into this passage that you can't really tell from just reading it, is that this cave in the side of this massive sheer cliff and this deep, deep spring that went down into it was called the Gates of the Netherworld by the locals. Pan was the Greek god of fertility, and this deep, seemingly this spring of life-giving water that came forth seemed to the pagans of the time to be the entry into the underworld, this deep, deep spring, and they would throw in these sacrifices and offerings into this spring, and they would say, this is where Pan rises up to the world in the spring and goes back down into during the fall. And so where Jesus was saying, this is the gates of the netherworld that won't prevail against his church, he's saying that up against this place called the gates of the netherworld. It's in this context, in front of an active pagan temple to the pagan god of fertility and life, that Peter made his profession of faith to the true God of all life, saying, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. It's in this context, against this imposing over 100-foot rock face where there's a seemingly literal door to Hades, that Jesus said to Peter, whose name means rock, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. And it's this same church that Jesus Christ founded 2,000 years ago that we find ourselves members of today. But it's also this same church that in the past decades and even the past few years has at times seems as if it's not quite built on rock, and it's been rocked by scandals. Many have left, and many who have stayed have found it hard to trust the church in the midst of the storms that have assailed it. You just look at the news, and it seems like there's always some new church leader, even among the bishops or the cardinals, found guilty of not acting as Christ would. Shortly after I entered in seminary in 2013, all of the local scandals began to break loose, and I was a very confused young seminarian. Or, we might be confused. There's some statement that comes from some bishop or maybe even the Vatican that seems to invite more confusion rather than clarity. A bishop makes a decision on wearing masks or not wearing masks, or allowing certain sacraments or not allowing certain sacraments, and we get confused and we're not quite sure what's going on. And it can even sometimes be closer to home. Father Bodine and I aren't immune from at times making the wrong decision about how the parish is run or saying something silly or stupid in our homilies. And at our core, we Christians really don't like how human our church is, how we can have all of these things that make us think, wow, this is really Jesus' church that he founded. We just don't like how the leadership that the church has been entrusted to, and even those members of the church who we are, can sometimes just be so human. But in the end, this is what Jesus gave us, and he promised that the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. When it comes to how human the church can be, we all have to remember that this is what Christ gave us, the ups and downs. He foresaw it all. And he foresaw in that moment when he entrusted the keys to Peter here in the gospel, that not too long after, just a few chapters later, he foresaw that Peter would deny him 3 times. but he still made Peter the first pope anyway. Because even with all of Peter's faults, Jesus still made the promise, the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against the church. So at varying times, for varying reasons, and we can say to different degrees, do I even trust the church anymore? But in reality, that's not the question we should be asking. We should be asking, do I trust Jesus Christ? Do I trust that the gates of the netherworld will not prevail against the church that he established? To abandon ourselves to God and to completely trust in him in the midst of confusion is not an easy task. But in the end, we have to look at these 2,000 years of history of the church and realize that despite the efforts of many, the church has always survived. God has time and time again kept this promise that he made to us in today's gospel. After Napoleon bragged to a cardinal that he was going to trust the church, the cardinal famously quipped back, "If in 1800 years we clergy have failed to destroy the church, do you really think that you'll be able to do it?" The gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. So what is a concerned Catholic to do in a situation where they're not sure if they can really trust the church? The only real solution is to trust Jesus Christ, to put our full confidence and trust in him, even when the waves are swirling around us in life, to find the rock who is Christ and find that rock who is Peter, on whom the church was established. And a good thing to do can be to follow the advice of the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. There's a lot of things in the church, and indeed in the whole world, that we as the people of Forest Lake, Minnesota, just really can't change. We can be frustrated about the lack of holiness and godliness in the church and in the world, but in the end, where does that frustration get us? It only builds up anxiety and anger. What can I change? Recall 1 Corinthians 12, speaking on the church as the mystical body of Christ. If one part suffers, all parts suffer with it. Okay, yeah, we know that. We've been experiencing that. But also, if one part is honored, all the parts share its joy. When we turn off the news, when we click away from the blogs, and we get off social media, and we instead devote time to our own holiness, when we devote time to God in prayer, we can start changing the church starting with ourselves, and we can start to effect change. As we cooperate with God in becoming holier ourselves, we can then help others to do the same in our families, in our communities, in our parish, in our diocese, and beyond. The sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us, St. Paul says in his letter to the Romans. Do we have hope for that glory that will be revealed to us? Do we trust in what God has promised? If so, we know that when we humbly follow God's will in our lives, no matter what goes on around us, he will protect us and he will keep us safe. No matter what storms batter our world, we know that Christ has promised to protect his bride, the church, safe from being conquered by Satan. Because upon this rock he has built his church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it.